Good evening. My name is Todd Green. I'm an associate professor of religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and I'm also the interim director for the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening from the Luther community and the broader public. Tonight will feature a presentation and a conversation on the topic Religion and U.S. Diplomacy from Bush to Biden. Our speaker this evening will be Dr. Shaun Casey of Georgetown University. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement at Luther College. The center's purpose is to facilitate dialogue and understanding about responsible citizenship and the most pressing ethical issues of our time. The format for this evening will feature roughly a 20 to 25-minute presentation by Dr. Casey. This will be followed by a brief conversation between Dr. Casey and myself, which in turn will be followed by a question and answer period with you, the audience. So if you are tuning in live to this event and would like to submit a question, please do so at any time during the event by using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Let me now introduce more fully our speaker, Dr. Shaun Casey. Dr. Casey is the director of the Berkeley Center and a professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also a senior fellow with the Luce Project on Religion and its Publics at the University of Virginia. Prior to his current position, Dr. Casey held a teaching position at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and served with the Center for American Progress and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. During the second Obama administration, Dr. Casey served as the inaugural director of the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Dr. Casey and his colleagues in that office advised Secretary of State John Kerry on foreign policy matters related to religion, and they also supported the U.S. government's diplomatic corps in engaging with religious actors across the globe. It's a real pleasure to have Dr. Casey with us this evening, speaking on a topic that I know is near and dear to his heart. The topic is religion and U.S. diplomacy from Bush to Biden. Dr. Casey, welcome.
Thank you, Todd. It's great to be with you tonight. And before I get into my presentation, I want to give you thanks for the invitation. And I remember fondly our times together as colleagues in the State Department. We were sort of a couple of woebegone religion scholars running around all the international affairs nerds. And it was a lovely time. And I just thank you for this invitation. And also, I appreciate the hard work of your staff there at the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement. I really appreciate all the hospitality. I wish I could be there in person. Be a much better evening and discussion, but we'll do the best that we can. Let me just draw a quick map of where I want to go in the next 20 minutes. I'm going to take the presidents in order. So we'll start with George W. Bush, then move to the Obama administration, then we'll talk about the Trump administration, and spend a little bit of time at the end thinking about where the Biden administration might go down some of these paths, whether they'll take a similar route or take a different path as we sort of hypothesize about where they want to go. I think certainly in the Bush era, it was the day of 9/11 and the attacks and then the subsequent invasion on the part of the United States that really awakened the American public, at least, to the reality of lived religion around the globe and the complexity of religion. And the variety of responses in the American population show various levels of religious literacy and illiteracy. And certainly the rise of Islamophobia is something you're an expert in, Todd, in a way that I can only admire from afar. But we saw in the lead up to the war on Iraq, I think, a willful ignorance of the religious dynamics on the ground. And if you read through the massive literature looking back at Iraq, it's very clear the administration, at least at senior levels, didn't care. They didn't want details that might have slowed down the rush to war. And their volumes that detail the decision-making inside the White House very clearly that there was the big idea. And the big idea was that by invading Iraq, somehow you could transform the Middle East, which it was allegedly allergic to democracy. And if America can make a big statement there and help reinstitutionalize democracy, or maybe bring it for the first time, at least in the Bush view, that would set off a chain of good reactions across the Middle East. Now, we know that in the invasion planning, our invading forces had very little literacy or expertise in religion, and it was certainly shunted aside whenever that was raised in the decision-making up to the decision to invade. And I think that's a tragic mistake. Because what they missed was that religion in Iraq was very, very complicated. Even in ancient history was there. there were scholars and historians who knew that story and tried to warn the administration that they didn't understand what they were buying when they were invading, and yet those scholars were not listened to. But even after the invasion, very quickly the insurgency arose among Sunni and Shia. And again, our inability to sort those complexities in our attempt basically to shut down the religious voices that were indigenous to Iraq actually made the situation worse. The classic example there was when Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani wanted to talk to the leader of the Coalitional Provisional Authority and was turned away. And the classic quote came from a Washington Post reporter that said Mr. Brimmer, who was leading the coalitional authority, just saw him as another old man in a turban, not knowing that he was this revered religious leader. And since that date, in 2003 or 2004, the Ayatollah has not spoken directly to a U.S. government employee, even though we noticed that when Pope Francis was there a few weeks ago, he in fact did get an audience with Sistani. So a real opportunity was missed early on that led to just catastrophic, cascading negative effects, not only in the insurgency, but when we tried to write their constitution for them. And Ayatollah Sistani actually called for a democratically elected government and insisted that Iraqis should write their own constitution. So this, to the American government, obscure religious leader actually turned out to be the greater advocate for democracy than the United States government itself. We're still paying a price. My children and my grandchildren come into this world, they will still be paying the price, both literally in terms of cash, but also in terms of fractured global politics because of the bad decision-making to invade and the willful ignorance about religious dynamics there. Then we move to the Obama administration. In many ways, President Obama was elected saying, I'm here to shut down the wrong war, and I want to go into Afghanistan and try to find Osama bin Laden and the terrorists who seek to attack our country. Now, Obama found that much harder to do. It's easier to campaign on that than it was to actually deliver a full peace there, but he got us closer. I think at the heart of the Obama strategy was Muslim engagement, which was something of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, calling for Muslim engagement is a better rhetorical frame than the global war on terror, because the global war on terror set a presumption of guilt into the laps or on the heads of Muslims anywhere. You saw a Muslim, you saw a potential terrorist, and that continues to cascade across the Islamic world when they interact with American government officials. But calling for engagement, as President Obama did in his Cairo speech in 2009, was an attempt to reset the relationships. But it was more complicated than I think they understood. Truth be told, there is no single entity called the Muslim or the Islamic world, just as there's no such thing as the Christian world or Christian civilization, because both religions are so internally plural and diverse, have competing histories, competing schools of thought. It's highly reductive to say, well, there's one part of the world that is aligned with this religion or that religion, and it overlooks the fact that these are living traditions that have evolved differently in different places, and they cannot be subsumed under this general sort of categorization. Very quickly, leaders around the world in some of the Muslim majority countries became impatient with the engagement that Obama promised. And as several of them said to me, we don't need any more pretty speeches. We actually need policies, international, nation-to-nation, bilateral diplomacy that we focus on issues of mutual interest and mutual concern instead of throwing us all together into a category of 55 or 57 nations, whatever the number of nations is that are Muslim majority. And the initial exultation about Cairo wore pretty thin pretty quickly. We should have engaged with individual countries or with coalitions of countries. We should have engaged more robustly with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, for instance, rather than saying we were engaging with the Muslim world, because that sounded too generic, too non-specific. And the policy concerns of these countries varied from country to country. And we didn't seem like we were approaching the relationships in a very sophisticated manner. At least that's the feedback I got as I traveled across the globe. So John Kerry, who I first met in 2005 and had an ongoing relationship with, when he became Secretary of State in February of 2013, as the story was told to me, the first thing that happens to you when you become the Secretary of State is that an army of attorneys and briefers come and meet you half an hour at a time to tell you the categories like, these are things you'll never be able to do, so please forget them and don't try to do them. Here are the category of things you can do possibly sometime over the course of the next 4 years. And here's a basket of things that with a stroke of a pen you can do. And one of the briefers talking about that last category told Secretary Kerry that based on an executive order that Obama had signed in early 2009 to create a series of faith-based offices had included authorization for the State Department to set up a religious analytic office. And for whatever reason, Secretary Clinton never pulled the trigger on that. So as the story was told to me, when the briefer was reading this laundry list of things that the secretary could do right away, Kerry interrupted him and turned to his chief of staff and said, call Shaun and see if you can twist his arm to come in and launch this office. I got an email in early March and I found myself talking to the chief of staff in the State Department with this offer to come in and launch this office. And I negotiated for about 13 seconds before I accepted the offer. And I finished out the spring teaching term at Wesley Seminary. And then in the summer of 2013 came in and launched the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And let me just summarize very quickly our mission. As we saw our work, we had 3 tasks. The first task was to consult with the secretary when religion cut across his portfolio, which if you think back to the headlines of the day, religion was frequently a topic that he had to deal with. We were an office he could call on to say, help me understand this particular religious community. For instance, I accompanied him on his first trip to the Vatican when Pope Francis had been selected about 9 months before. And Francis had just selected his new Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. And so I traveled with Kerry to be in that meeting. And then ironically, in December of 2016, after the election, I was also with Kerry when he made his final trip. And actually, Kerry himself got a one-on-one audience with the Pope, which is highly irregular in Vatican diplomacy. So we tried to resource him such that he walked into meetings with deep knowledge of the religious dynamics for whatever conversation he might be involved in. Secondly, we had a mission to equip and train our embassies and posts. We have over 200 such posts around the world. And that's really where American foreign policy and diplomacy meets the road. It's when our ambassadors engage their host countries on as many issues as possible. And one of the central missions of our embassies and posts is to be able to interpret the host country back to the United States so we're smarter and wiser as we make policy from Washington. And the irony was, you walk into pretty much any American embassy or consulate, and Foreign Service officers are extraordinarily sophisticated in interpreting the history of that country, the culture of that country, the government, the parties, the economy. But when it came to religion, they go silent. And these are highly educated, cosmopolitan, sophisticated people, but they had never been given professional permission or actually tools to interpret religion as part of their sort of hermeneutical task. Now, the irony of that is pretty much any country in the world you go to, there are religious dynamics there now, less so and more so in different countries. But to go into Ukraine, to go into Iraq, and say religion doesn't matter here, it's just ludicrous on the face of it. And part of Kerry's intuition was that we've missed a lot of diplomatic opportunities because we weren't prepared to carry on conversations. And even if we'd been prepared, we were never sure who were the right people to talk to in the religious landscapes. So we advocated for every country, every embassy we went to do a religious landscape where you knew who the players were, majority, minority. You engaged not only with official leaders, but you also engaged with non-formal leaders. You tried to include women. You tried to include the marginalized, even within those communities. And you needed that kind of sophisticated understanding And when bullets started flying or people started invading, it's really tough to begin to build relationships with religious communities. But that's what we were seeing all around the world. And then our final mission, our third mission, was to be the point of contact for any entity, person, organization, scholar, either domestically or internationally, who is interested in either partnering with the State Department on mutually successful or interesting work around the world. And we became sort of traffic cops within the State Department. You know, it's a massive bureaucracy. There are 80,000 some global employees in the State Department. And a lot of people are very intimidated when they walk into the main state building there on C Street in Washington, because it's so inscrutable from the outside. So we literally met with thousands of people and many times handed them off to specialty offices inside the State Department who worked in that country of interest or worked on the particular cross-cutting issue. Now, sometimes we were the people who worked on those issues, but more often than not, we were introducing them around the building. And we found that, I think, to be a very successful formula, and I think we proved the concept. Then you fast forward or now go back to the beginning of the Trump era, and very clearly from early on, the Trump administration expressed no interest in engaging religious actors broadly, inclusively, nor understanding religious dynamics. They picked favorites and they picked losers among religions around the world. And they basically were quite clear that white Christian evangelicals living in America were their primary constituency because of their political value in terms of elections. They closed our office down and they hired a group of people. Even one of the secretaries himself had deep ties to sort of official Islamophobia in the United States. And so they gave privileged position to a certain strain of Christianity while simultaneously saying Muslims are bad actors and we're going to ban them. We're not going to let them travel to our country. And I took them 3 or 4 tries to get it written such a way it could pass constitutional muster in the current judiciary. But it was very clear from the get-go, religious freedom was colonized and was really made into a political tool to promote certain forms of Christianity around the world. And that in turn created political capital for the administration. And they frankly had no interest. And if we have time, we might talk about their deteriorating relationship with the Vatican, which was really quite unprecedented, at least in modern presidential history. So here we are as we think about, well, let me add a couple of other things. I think their engagement in Israel-Palestine was heavy-handed. I think they clearly did not want to do anything to upset the Netanyahu administration. They turned a blind eye towards settlement growth. They cut subsidization of the Palestinian Authority and on the West Bank. And essentially, they undermined any real hope for the two-state solution, such that now it's really an open question whether it's even politically feasible to think about, much less actually implement any form of the two-state solution. In a sense, they've sabotaged our diplomacy, I think, for the foreseeable future in that space. Their tactic, their anti-Muslim tactic in Iran, I think, failed. They tried a strategy of maximum pressure somehow, and we walked away from the joint agreement with the 5 countries and Iran to have them ratchet back their uranium enrichment process, which now leaves Iran much closer to actually developing weapon-grade material, and that's playing out now as Biden is trying to restart those conversations. So that anti-Muslim strategy, I think, failed and made the world a much more dangerous place on a number of fronts. And now we find ourselves in the first months of the Biden administration. And at this point, I'm hypothesizing, I'm guessing, I'm reading tea leaves. I have no insider information to reveal. But it is interesting. I think, first of all, I think we can expect the Biden administration to restore the robust relationship between the United States and the Vatican diplomatically that will be analogous to what we saw in the Obama-Biden era. I think it's very clear the Vatican wants this, and I think this will be one of the first political ambassadorship appointments I don't know who it will be. I can't give you odds on the top three candidates or anything like that. But I do believe that given Biden's serious Catholicism, that they will work very quickly and astutely to restore that. And we've got a great charge d'affaires in that embassy right now, who I think is going to do a stellar job in this interregnum where we don't have an ambassador sitting in the chair. But look for that announcement, I think, in coming months. I think, too, there's a reasonable hope they will start some version of my old office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. It's not clear where it will be in the bureaucracy. Will it still be in the Secretary's Bureau? How many staffers will it have? What will the mission be? Will it be like the old one, or will it evolve in some ways? And all that's quite possible. I also think he will try to redeem and right-size religious freedom. I think he'll go back to a more mainstream notion of religious freedom, where we really do work against religious persecution, no matter what the community is that's receiving the persecution. You won't see the ambassadors putting fingers on the scale to tip things towards Christians in an overt way. And so that'll be an interesting appointment to see who is nominated to be the religious freedom ambassador. And I look for the right. I look for Republicans to howl and scream because they're going to lose access to the White House in a way. I mean, they'll still be welcome, but they will not own the full franchise on religious freedom going forward. And that drumbeat's already starting in some conservative Christian circles, that it's already clear they don't like Christians. And that's a conclusion based on no evidence, but nevertheless, reflects the heavy political thunder around religious freedom today. Just to give you an example, we now have 3 white Christian nationalists who've been appointed by the U.S. government, who are on the government payroll on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. And one of those 3 doesn't even believe that Biden was duly elected as president, and yet they're now on the federal payroll and will be for some time, because they serve, I think, 2-year terms, and they can succeed themselves once. So that's really toxic space right now. And I guess the last thing to say here is that Biden has talked a lot about trying to address populism, both domestically but also internationally, because there is a global wave of populist regimes everywhere you look around the country. And it's often one of the identifiers of these kind of populist regimes that there are favored religions and simultaneously disfavored religions. And that's often in kind of a Christian-Muslim axis, where certain Christian tribes, depending on the country, do receive government affirmation and even funding, and religious minorities in Western countries and in other places around the world that are Muslim or they're non-Christian, they often become the abused, if you will, at the hands of official government agents. And that's going to take some really sophisticated thinking about how you sort that, both in the United States, but also in Europe, across Africa now, and in Asia, and even in the Middle East as well. And so if they're really going to address global populism, they're going to have to find a way to deal with the complex religious dynamics in the various national and regional contexts. And that's going to be a very, very complicated project. And there are 1,000 ways that kind of engagement can go wrong. So let me stop there. I think, as my family says, Dad, you can talk for hours on this stuff. So this has been an act of incredible restraint on my part, not to go down too many rabbit holes. But I look forward, Todd, to your reactions and to the Q&A as we end up later in the program doing that.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Shaun. Very fascinating introduction and some broad perspectives going from for about 20 years, right, as we go into this the Biden administration and what to expect. You and I can have a brief conversation, and then we can open it up to questions from the audience. And that's just a reminder for those of you tuning in live right now. Feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we will get to as many of these as we can. If we go back to Bush, the Bush administration, you used a very particular phrase when it came to its approach to religion, particularly in the lead up to Afghanistan, and particularly the Iraq War, I think. The phrase was willful ignorance, right? Not just generic ignorance, right? But a willful ignorance. And I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on what explains the willful ignorance of the Bush administration during those early years of this kind of buildup to what came to be known during the Bush era as the War on Terror?
One of the most famous scholars of American international or foreign policy strategy, John Lewis Gaddis, has written a book, and he steals an idea from Isaiah Berlin, the British philosopher, between foxes and hedgehogs. And this is essentializing, this is stereotyping, but this is one of the cases where some of those labels, I think, apply. A hedgehog is somebody who knows one big thing. And like everything somehow is woven into that big thing. And we've all had friends like this who become obsessed by some food or some author or something. And every time you talk to them, that's all they talk about. And if somebody says, how about those Red Sox? Somehow that person can weave the Red Sox into their latest fad diet or something. And they just can't be moved off this idea. And Gaddis makes an argument that George Bush was sort of that way, that invading Iraq was his hedgehog idea. And if you read the insider baseball books, it's very clear Bush never asked his foreign policy apparatus, what are the pros and cons of invading Iraq? Help me make an informed decision. Give me all the information, all the consequences of invading, not invading, or any other possible. He did not use the normal National Security Council policy debate process. He had no interest in debating. He made up his mind fairly early after 9/11 that this is what he wanted to do. And the vice president and other people fell in line behind that. And that circumvented the normal foreign policy apparatus we've had since 1947 with the National Security Act of 47, set up this architecture for making sure the decision maker, the president, had all the information he or she would need to make as well-informed a decision as possible. So it's documented. Richard Haas's book, Wars of Choice, I think is the best single read on this, where, and of course, he was in the administration. He was running the Office of Policy Planning at that point in 2003 in the lead up to the war. So there is a record there. Now, foxes are people who say, it's more complicated than that. And in many ways, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, I'm writing a book now, and I call us a den of foxes. We were the people who would say, it's a lot more complicated. And kind of like religion professors often do, when thrown the question, we tend to say, well, it's not black and white. There are 50,000 shades of sepia here, and let me draw you a map. And now, that's good in the classroom, but when you're the National Security Council and the president wants a decision memo, sometimes it's hard for us to adapt to those forms of discourse. But Gaddis' argument is you need a decision-making process that tells the president all the consequences to the 5 or 6 options that he or she may be considering, and that didn't happen. We, however, were in a position to say, okay, if you understand the religious dynamics in Ukraine, let us write you a memo, let us draw you a map, we'll talk to the experts, we'll use our own expertise. We will try to portray as accurate a picture for you so that if you choose option number 1, here are the likely consequences. Or if you choose option 5, here are the likely consequences. Now, we didn't want to become just the office who instantly said, well, it's more complicated than you think. We actually had to help people move towards having actionable information that they could make the choices on. So we had to do this sort of dialectic between getting as smart as we could, but also understanding where the political parameters and where the policy parameters were. And part of that was my intermediary relationship between our amazing staff and the actual formal decision-making process. I think in Gaddis's language, the Bush leadership were all hedgehogs. They wanted to go to war. They did not want to hear any contrary evidence, and we paid a huge price as a result. We tried to build an office of foxes such that the Secretary of State knew ahead of time what the Vatican was probably thinking, what issues might lead to relationship building and success, where are you going to get criticized when you go in and talk to the Vatican Secretary of State. So we tried to prep him with as much information as possible when religion was part of whatever policy decision was going on.
Thank you for that response. Kind of maybe a connected question in terms of some of what you were just talking about as well, in light of also the news cycle recently. So you and I were talking before this event began just a while ago, and just yesterday we were talking about how President Biden announced the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan that should be carried out, he says, by September 11th of this year. That's 20 years of war, right? You've talked a little bit about the role of religious illiteracy in the U.S. government and its fueling and sustaining the war on terror. You particularly noted, for example, going into Iraq, right? Just this idea that Sunni and Shia are like they would just greet the Americans as liberators and with no understanding of the very complex history of these religious communities, right? So as the Biden administration sets about withdrawing troops, is it doing so with a greater degree of religious literacy and a better understanding of the complex role of religion in the region than what existed 20 years ago? I mean, are we significantly better off in government circles, at least in this administration, when it comes to an appreciation of the complexity of religion than 20 years ago? Have we made progress, at least in that area?
Yeah. Well, here's where I think we've made progress, and then I'll talk about where I'm not sure. I think we know the status quo has failed. Now, people forget that we first went into Afghanistan and intervened in a stalemated civil war between the Taliban and the so-called Northern Alliance. And we needed to thread that needle because we had to go through that battleground to get to where we thought bin Laden was. Now, Michael Walzer has written at great length about the moral danger of intervening in any civil war. And I can't rehearse his argument here, but I think he's the smartest, where he basically says you intervene in a civil war, much as a stalemated civil war, at high cost. Unintended consequences can just cascade, and that's what Afghanistan was. What I think we should have done, and again, this hindsight's 2020. I totally understand it. Once Osama bin Laden fled and escaped, and there are arguments about the culpability of the U.S. of the Bush administration in that, but let's not drill down too far into that, or we'd be here for weeks. But once he left, I think you can make the moral argument we should have exited Afghanistan, because we disrupted a stalemate. We came down on the side of the Northern Alliance, and what emerged, is the government of Afghanistan. I don't know if it was ever really stable. Our work there was done. That the perpetrators of 9/11 left, and we knew they were gone, and they were probably not in Afghanistan. At that point, I think we should have extracted our limited forces and just said, we're not going to pick sides in this. Instead, we decided we had to pick sides there because somehow we wanted to punish Al Qaeda. And I think here we are. I think that strategy failed. And I will also say, one of the missions in attempting to get a better granular understanding of religious dynamics, we drafted military chaplains into this process of actually being the religious liaisons, which was a disaster. Our chaplaincy is overwhelmingly Christian. It's often conservative Christians, and none of these people have been trained in any understanding of religions beyond Christianity with any sophistication. And they certainly never been trained in how do you do this in a war zone when you're sitting there in fatigues and you've got crosses on your lapels and you're sitting across the table from local Muslim leaders. I think it actually puts chaplains at risk. They're supposed to be non-combatants, but when they're eliciting potentially secure information or intelligence from local religious leaders, it's really hard to see them as non-combatants there, and they don't know how to do the job. And if you talk to the chiefs of the chaplaincy corps, they will admit to you they know their corps of chaplains are not capable of doing this, and yet they were not in a position to argue back to the Joint Chiefs and say, no, this is a mistake, we can't do this, because that would violate the chain of command. And so a whole cottage industry has sort of arisen around this notion of chaplains, because they're religious people, so they understand all religious people. So let's put them as community liaisons, and they just were inept. So I think to the extent the Biden people are more sophisticated, they know that old strategy did not work, and it's just keeping doing failing things is sort of the definition of insanity. And that's what they see happening over the last 20 years. Now, do they know Taliban theology? Do they have a granular understanding? I have no idea. Now, it's possible that they do. There are intelligence equities once upon a time. I'm not sure those equities are still there in the federal government who are capable of doing that kind of research, but I have no knowledge of whether or not the Biden administration has availed themselves of that. I just think they've looked at the old strategy and said, this is not working and we're not going to sustain it because it's just lose-lose for us.
Thank you, Shaun. A reminder to the audience tuning in live right now, if you have questions for Dr. Casey, please submit those in the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Speaking of which, we have a few already, so let me turn to some of these questions. Our first one, could you talk a little bit about how and whether the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has operated differently under different administrations? And maybe if we just, Shaun, take that question, focus on the four administrations, or 3 plus looking forward, right, in the past 20 years. What sort of evolution and maybe at a certain point devolution, right, have we encountered with that commission? Well,
let me give you a little bit of history very quickly here. In 1998, Congress passed a law, the U.S. International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, with strong bipartisan support. Now, the year before, it had failed miserably. I don't think they actually ever got it out of committee because it was so contentious. Now, remember, at this point, President Bill Clinton is politically vulnerable. He's wounded because of the Lewinsky scandal. And this bill set up the architecture, our diplomatic architecture for dealing with religious freedom. And the main thing it did is it established an Office of Religious Freedom in the State Department with an ambassador at large for international religious freedom. But the Republicans in Congress at that point really didn't trust Bill Clinton to do this right, to do this well. And they appointed what was supposed to be a temporary watchdog, semi-independent body, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And at the beginning, it was bipartisan. There were Christians, there were Jews. I don't think there were any Muslims at that point. But it was not a bad commission. And the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, and the White House get to name, I think, 3 commissioners each. And that was supposed to make it bipartisan and, frankly, not partisan. But over the years, conservative Christians have dominated the leadership. In fact, they've dominated the membership because Republicans have controlled the Senate and the House longer and more, and the presidency more often collectively than the Democratic Party has. So it's always had a Christian conservative bent. And as we move through history, in the beginning, there really were some luminaries across the political spectrum and across the religious spectrum. That is less and less true now. And I think the Trump administration is sort of the all-star in terms of the sort of devolution of that entity. So we now have 3 white Christian nationalists who are evangelical or fundamentalist Christians who are very explicit. They believe their job on the commission is to promote Christianity around the world. All 3 of these people have also been active in Islamophobic agencies and in movements in their own professional lives. One of them even tweeted selfies of himself with Mohammed bin Salman and talking about what a great advocate of religious freedom this guy is. They've settled a religious discrimination lawsuit out of court. They've had a scathing internal GSA review of their floundering mission. And so it's really broken at this point. And they also produce an annual report. In addition to the annual report on religious freedom, the State Department does. And I saw the sort of internal debate where USCIRF would say, well, our report's tougher than the State Department's report is. So the State Department's getting soft on religious freedom violations. We are the arbiters. We're the watchdogs. We're the vanguard here. And so what happens now is that there's an industry in Washington, D.C., sort of a professional in international religious freedom cabal, if you will. And it sadly has become, we talk more about it than the Democrats do, so we clearly care more about religious freedom. We have more meetings, we have more conferences, so obviously we care more than the State Department does. And it's really this internal competition between the State Department office and the commission itself. And in the 20 some odd years since we've had that commission, the level of religious persecution around the world has not gone down. So it's not unlike what's happened in Afghanistan. We have a partisan policy apparatus here that's not making a difference in the world where people are being persecuted because of their religion. And I think it needs to be depoliticized. I would advocate that we have a career diplomat be appointed as the ambassador. So it's that ambassador is not responsible or answerable to any particular religious tribe. They're not answerable to a political party. It's a career diplomat who's actually done bilateral negotiations with problematic countries. And then you build positive off-ramps for some of these countries who are bad behaviors and simply say, you do these 5 things and we're going to take you off our list of countries of particular concern. But there's very little discussion today about how do we actually lead countries to better behavior. And I think the current system is set up to make that much more difficult. I don't think we need the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. That's a minority view. I have a lot of friends in that world who don't like me saying that. But again, I would simply challenge them to say, show me how the current architecture, and particularly the commission, has contributed significantly to any improvement in religious freedom around the world.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. Our next question. Since we have seen a rise of secularism around the world, how do you, Dr. Casey, foresee the role of the Biden administration in balancing anti-Islamophobic initiatives and policies and freedom of religion initiatives and policies?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't accept the frame of balancing. I mean, we invest far more in religious freedom. I mean, USAID under the Trump administration now is spending a lot of money on religious freedom efforts. And again, I find that unintelligible. I don't understand why that's being done. That's the State Department's portfolio. So I think I don't see a conflict between doing both. I think if we can recalibrate religious freedom and really focus on trying to move the bad behaviors or mitigating their bad behavior, I don't see how. And oftentimes, I mean, look at the 2 genocides or near genocides we're looking at. The Uyghurs in Western China are looking at Rohingya who've been driven out of Myanmar. You know, it used to be sort of a standard trope among religious freedom folk that, well, Christianity is the most persecuted religion around the world. I never, even if that could be proven, I'm not sure what does that yield in terms of policy changes. But we now have millions of Muslims who in recent time have been persecuted, either imprisoned in massive work camps in China, or driven into another country. In the case of Myanmar, and Islam is part of the problem there. Now, that doesn't explain everything, but that certainly is woven deeply into both of those potential genocides. So being a Muslim in certain parts of the world is not a good thing. It's not a sexy thing, and it's a very hard thing. So I don't see any contradiction for trying to reform and rethink religious freedom while simultaneously trying to find people around the world who are successfully combating things like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and trying to give those people more resources to do that work. I think it's both and. But by weight and volume, we do far more on religious freedom than we do on trying to tamp down an anti-Semitism or Islamophobia.
Thank you. Another question, or a series of questions here. Will the Christian and Muslim worlds ever achieve peace? Is the United States the bridge to coexistence between these worlds, or is it the flawed country that is an obstacle to peace? And then finally, how much significance does the meeting between the Pope and Iraq's Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani have on U.S. diplomacy? Wow,
those are 3 different evenings worth of events. Let me see and remind me if I forget them. I think that the papal visit is symbolic. I do think it's interesting. I have friends who criticize the Vatican for being drawn to this. Well, I have an Egyptian friend who talks about statement or accord fatigue, where history is full of these grand covenants or agreements or statements where lots of religious leaders in the top sign these things, and then they move on and they have another meeting in another 5-star hotel somewhere in Europe. But on the ground, behaviors don't necessarily change. That kind of declaration culture doesn't really seem ever to filter down to grassroots behavior. And so I think there's a lot of fatigue about that. But on the other hand, I think the Pope's interests are in some ways much more personal. I think when he has these kinds of meetings, and he was in the UAE and signed a similar agreement, the primary action there is he's trying to protect the small Roman Catholic faithful in those countries. That ultimately, that is sort of diplomatic mission one many times for the Vatican, is to protect the faithful. And they've made a decision, I think, that these kind of declarations help when they negotiate them with individual countries. And who's to say that that's good or who's to say that's bad? So I think they're not quite as guilty of making these big declarations just for the sake of making big declarations. My Egyptian friend may be a little too harsh on the Vatican there. I do think Biden is very clear to the second question that our diplomacy, the effectiveness of American diplomacy is directly tied to the state of our domestic home front. And we certainly are deeply divided over religion. We're deeply divided within Christianity. The lines between Christianity and what are minority religions in the United States are deeper. They're much more complicated today, and they've been explicitly exploited by the former administration. So if Biden wants us to be more effective in engaging a more complicated world, we've got some repairment to do in our own society. And I think that's a daunting task. I come from Red America. That's where I grew up. I still spent a lot of time in what people on the East and West Coast call flyover states, which is just a horrific term. But the Democratic Party, in many ways, has pulled out of those states. I mean, it's extraordinary how there's very little Democratic Party apparatus in most of the real estate in the United States. And I'm not sure a presidency or an administration has the power to do the kind of healing and the convening and the conversing at a local cultural level to begin to heal these rifts. So I think it's going to be hard. I think American diplomacy now is in retreat based on the divisions that we've seen over the last 4 years. And it's not going to be easy in the course of the next 4 years for the Biden administration to make a whole lot of progress in turning that around. We need to spend more time in thinking about what is going to begin to turn the tide. So I think in the short run, no. I think the answer is no. America is not going to be the model of toleration that shines a light to the rest of the world. I think that if the current trends continue, we are facing a really vexing period of our history here. I hope we find a multitude of ways to begin to address those. And until we do, I think our diplomacy is going to be handicapped to a certain degree internationally. I remember one of the last trips I took before the election in 2016, I was actually in the UK, and I was with a group of very, very sophisticated cosmopolitan people. And the first question I got was, has America lost its mind? and we were supposed to be non-political. I couldn't make partisan statements, and I had control officers from the embassy with me, and any slip of my tongue in a partisan way would have certainly reverberated back in places that would not have been happy with me. And I thankfully, the election had not taken place, and I said something like, well, not yet. But the world was looking at America in the lead up to that election, and people were concerned. People who care about American diplomacy outside our borders were really afraid of what was going to happen. And so the warning signs were clear in the eyes of some of our allies across the globe, even before that election took place.
I'm sure there's a lot of light you could shed on the challenges of doing diplomacy at the end of the Obama administration and after the election had taken place. Yeah, you and I overlapped a little bit. I stayed in for about 4 or 5 months into the Trump administration, and I took one major trip abroad on behalf of the State Department. It was to Europe, and I remember speaking to a group of young university students in Hamburg, Germany. And it was in the U.S. consulate there. And my topic, of course, was Islamophobia in Europe. And I was trying to help them compare, lead a conversation on the different dynamics in Europe versus the United States, particularly legally, in terms of the legal infrastructure that makes, some things a little bit more challenging, perhaps in some parts of Europe than in the United States. And then in other ways, it's vice versa. But behind me the whole time was this huge cutout of Donald Trump. And they're looking at this guy talking about Islamophobia, as a United States government representative, and then a big, cutout of Donald Trump behind us. And they're like, is this for real? Are you kidding me? You advise on Islamophobia in the Trump administration? How do you even exist? So, and I was like, yeah, this is, I had to be careful because I was in a different position, not an academic at the time, but there was part of me was like, yeah, if you think this looks ridiculous, it feels ridiculous. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really right. And I think, where the Trump administration had these big ministerials on international religious freedom. And one of the leading authorities, or no, let me rephrase that, one of the leading Islamophobes in the United States was sitting in the front row. And I had Muslim friends who were there, and they were saying, like, okay, we know what's going on here. And so when the ambassador got up and said, well, we believe in religious freedom for all, there were Muslims in the audience who were like, I'm not buying this. And how can they say that with a straight face while they're simultaneously issuing Muslim travel bans? So, yeah, it was a dark period in American diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from the audience. What can the Biden administration do to counter the rise of populist radical right actors in Europe? And I can maybe even tack onto that question, including the way that many far right parties in Europe have targeted Muslim communities. What can the Biden administration do? Can it be effective?
Well, when I ran the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, the special representative for Muslim communities was in our office and worked for me, and the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism worked for me. And we had several good conversations where the history of U.S. involvement globally on both of those issues, but in different ways and by different volumes, we sort of played whack-a-mole. When an episode took place that was egregious, where there was violence, majority violence towards a minority religion, we would send somebody in and say, this is terrible, you need to stop this behavior. And again, that is part of diplomacy. I totally understand that. But as one of our stakeholders in the anti-Semitism space once said famously in our suite, he said, there are a lot of people monitoring anti-Semitism around the world. We know it when it flares up in a micro level and at a macro level. That's the easy part. The hard part is the combating anti-Semitism. And so what I asked our envoy to do, and asked one of our staffers, who was also an AAR loose fellow like you were, Todd, Jerome Kopulski, who I know you know. I said, can you do a study in Europe, Western and Central Europe, and find civil society groups that are effectively addressing anti-Semitism on the ground? And if we can identify them, perhaps we can help them find resources to build their programs up to scale, rather than sitting back at Washington saying, well, what are the root causes of anti-Semitism? Do you have any ideas? I don't know. How about you? Or and instead of sort of admiring the problem from afar, let's find groups who are effectively doing this work on the ground across Europe and put a magnifying lens on them and find ways to send foreign aid to those organizations. So we don't come in saying, yet again, America has figured out how to fix anti-Semitism in Finland or something. We're going to drop a report from 50,000 feet and tell you, read our report and everything will be fine, because we know that's not how behavior changes. So we tried. Now, this was late. This was in 2016. Now, had the office continued, I think we would have been in a position to be able to, first of all, say, well, who's combating this well on the ground? Who are the smart people in Finland? Who are the smart people in Poland? Who are the smart people in Germany? And let's see what the best practices are. Let's see if they need more resources, and can we help them magnify the best practices? And Jerome did some really fine research on that, but then the clock struck 12 and my services were no longer needed. So that's where I hope we can make progress, is actually listening to peacemakers on the ground who know the terrain in a way that American diplomats will never be able to master? And can we find a way to partner with their organizations and their networks to make their work more effective and more widely distributed?
Shaun, we're coming to the end of our time here, so I thought maybe I'd throw one more question at you. It's back to your time at the State Department overseeing the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. But I'm kind of interested, maybe as a little personal reflection. You noted that the opportunity to create that office existed prior to John Kerry becoming Secretary of State, but he was the one that actually, gave it the green light. What is it about John Kerry, in terms of your personal knowledge of him, that led him to want to elevate religion in the State Department in terms of the way it was being invoked and used and understood in foreign affairs? Is there something about John Kerry's personal life, his personal convictions, that really helps explain that decision to you?
Yeah, I think I have a friend who says liberals throw money at problems, conservatives throw sermons, and academics throw bibliographies at them. So I'm going to play true to form on the academic. John Kerry's autobiography is really a great read. And he does talk about his own personal faith. So I think there's a line from his own Catholicism and evolution as a Catholic Christian to this notion that religion is ubiquitous religions are ubiquitous around the planet. They're public, they're consequential, they're powerful, and internally very, very complicated. And I think as he traveled the world as a diplomatic child of a diplomat, he early on began to see that everybody wasn't Catholic like he was. And so I think he as he struggled with his own faith and the crises in his life, he lost his best friend in Vietnam. And he details this pretty well in his autobiography. He was just drawn to the complexity of religion. And then when he became a politician, he saw what I just said, that religions are very powerful tools for good, for bad, for 1,000 stops in between. And it takes some expertise to be able to interpret that to diplomats and political decision makers. So he's had this personal fascination with religion all along. And I think then after the invasion of Iraq and in our intervention in Afghanistan, he saw too. So he built an amazing network of relationships with religious leaders all around the world and had credibility in many of those camps. So I think he also learned a lot from Madeleine Albright's book, The Mighty and the Almighty. And then he became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he and I had kind of an on and off conversation over that span from 2005 to 2013. I helped him write some speeches. We had several long evening into the night conversations about all this. So he really has a keen mind. He's read a lot, and he's got an intellectual curiosity that's not true of every politician of his stature, at least in my experience in Washington, D.C. And he's open to learning. He's open to actually being challenged. And he's a lifelong learner. So I think those are all the elements that go into his life. And he used to say he would rather be caught trying to solve problems. He saw himself as an activist Secretary of State. He was not a sort of passive, let's see how things play out. And it was very refreshing, I think, to work in an administration where he knew, as the old basketball saying goes, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And so he threw himself into very complex, and we see it. I think we see in the Iranian deal, I think we see it in the Paris Accord, that it was through his just seemingly inexhaustible energy and intellectual curiosity and asking staff to prepare him that this was one of the topics, and it made a difference. I mean, I don't think anyone else other than John Kerry would have launched this kind of office.
Well, let me conclude with words of appreciation. Dr. Shaun Casey, thank you for serving as our speaker this evening. We welcome the opportunity to learn from your experience and your expertise on the role of religion in U.S. diplomacy, and particularly following the trajectory of the past 20 years, and also looking into what might happen in the Biden administration. Thanks to everyone who tuned in this evening. For those of you who asked questions of Dr. Casey, we hope you found the conversation fruitful and constructive, and we hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Thanks so much.